This lecture will cover the industry as it rebounds from the crash of 1983 following the rise of Nintendo in 1985 until other very important developments in 1994 following the subsequent evolution thereon. We will begin with the rise of Nintendo, the most venerable gaming company in the world, followed by the beginnings of Sega and their failure to compete with Nintendo, even though they had superior hardware at the time. Then we will discuss Maxis and The Sims and open-ended gameplay, and end this lecture with the introduction and evolution of first-person shooters, the most well-received and most widely played game in the world today. The beginnings of Nintendo can be traced back to its founder, Hiroshi Yamauchi, in the 19th century, who would found this most venerable gaming company in the world, originally called Nintendo Kopai, and originally is going to produce playing cards, Hanafuda, otherwise known as flower cards, illustrating different parts of the year and seasons symbolically. Now, with these depictions of the seasons, they're very common in Western and non-Western art, and often reflect allegorical scenes and or the life cycle of humans. Whether or not we're in Japan or Western Europe, it's a very popular subject. At his retirement, Hiroshi Yamauchi had the biggest playing card company in America. His successor, Sekiro Yamauchi, is going to have been known as a ruthless businessman, raising his grandson, Hiroshi Yamauchi. Now, when we find Sekiro is going to die of a stroke unexpectedly, Hiroshi is pulled out of Waseda University and at 22 years of age was appointed the third president of Nintendo. However, workers doubted his youth and inexperience and organized a strike, believing the new young boss would cave. On the contrary, we see that Hiroshi is going to be as ruthless as his grandfather. He fired the ringleaders, and there was an almost complete purge of senior management at Nintendo. And we know that Hiroshi, who of course wanted people fiercely loyal to him, got rid of anyone who was not. Also wanted to get rid of anyone who was wed to the old ways, for he would, following this, modernize processes at Nintendo. And then in 1956, a very important event happened. He visited the U.S. playing card company in Cincinnati, the biggest manufacturer in the world at the time, and realized that their office and factory were no bigger than that of Nintendo. It was at this point that he realized the business was quite limited and decided to take it in a new direction. That new direction would prove elusive in the 1950s and 60s as Nintendo attempted to diversify their offerings and what markets they were involved in. They dabbled in a company that sold instant rice. They owned a taxi company. They even had love hotels, which are famous in Japan for you can rent them by the hour. It was said that Yamauchi had a very personal interest in the debauchery that happened in these specific hotels. However, all ventures failed, and Nintendo was on the verge of bankruptcy when something unexpected happened. It was upon this happenstance that in 1966 he visited and inspected the manufacturing lines, where he saw a retractable claw that had been designed by maintenance engineer Gunpei Yokoi. He had it developed as a real product to be sold at Christmas, calling it Ultra Hand. It sold over 1 million units. Seeing the viability of toys, he immediately established a toy division with Yokoi as its head. Following this, Yokoi would be in charge of developing a series of toys that incorporated basic electronics. The two biggest sellers following the Ultra Hand was the 10 billion barrel puzzle and Ultra Machine, which was a baseball pitcher, both seen here. They brought Nintendo collectively back from the brink. Now, by comparison, Nintendo was a very small toy company compared to others in America and abroad, so they tried to expand again in other venues. A recent development had left bowling alleys in Japan empty and derelict, so they purchased several and converted them into laser clay shooting systems as entertainment venues. And this, of course, was a short-lived fad. The first foray Nintendo had into video games came for their license for the Magnavox Odyssey tennis game for the Japanese market in 1974. Now, they already had their own series of color TV consoles that often played one game, such as tennis, but claimed to play more, with variations in the rules and different color overlays that we've discussed on televisions. Following this, they began producing arcade games, but were quite unremarkable, like the EVR Race here, with a top-down driving game. So we see that it would be instead another game by Yokoi himself that showed the potential of the business of video games as they expanded outside of the toy market. Here we find the Game & Watch, developed from 1980 and sold until 1991, is going to be an excellent demonstration of the personal philosophy of electronics design held by Yokoi, which was lateral thinking with withered technology, as he called it. Now, this is very self-consciously not trying to be cutting edge, but instead Nintendo looked for the familiar, and with Yokoi at its head, looked for withered tech that could be mass-produced cheaply. Well, it just so happened that while in 1979 on a bullet train, he saw a bored commuter fiddling with a calculator, and then he had an idea. At the time, Sharp and Casio were companies that were battling in the calculator market, leading to a surplus and stockpile of plenty of cheap LCD displays and also many semiconductors. With these two things being the definition of withered technology, as Yokoi would call it, he came up with Game & Watch. Both of these would help him create this pocket-sized watch, which could double as a game system. It was not the first handheld game console, however, but its phenomenal success did sell 44 million units, and of course takes Nintendo in a new direction. After the success of Donkey Kong, that we'll discuss here in a moment, we know that they converted different versions to the handheld version here for the video game, thus requiring a four-way directional control. And here we have one of the most fundamental developments that would be so important for later video game controllers. Here, Yokoi will design a simple cross overlay under which there were 4 buttons, which are called the D-pad. This was nicknamed the cross design, and was featured on every subsequent Nintendo controller and was imitated widely thereafter. The success of Game & Watch made Yamauchi, the president of the company, pay attention to video games ever more so. And at this time, resources would pour into the arcade division, leading to the development of several arcades such as Sheriff, Space Fever, Space Firebird, and then, more significantly, in 1979, Radar Scope. Owing much of its design and existence to Space Invaders and Galaxian, it did, however, feel original due to the new 3D third-person perspective that would look down at an angle on this field. Now, in Japan, it was a huge success, second only to Pac-Man, though its success did not translate to other markets. At the same time as the success in Japan, Nintendo of America, led by its president, Minoru Arakawa, in 1980 would put in a very large order for these cabinets from the maker back in Japan. And we find in America, the visuals did pull in players initially, but we found that after a while, the repetitive gameplay turned them off, and demand is going to tank. Thus, Nintendo would have a warehouse of around 3,000 units, meaning that this fledgling company in America nearly went bankrupt before it even started. Arakawa is said to have called his father-in-law, Yamauchi, the president of Nintendo of Japan, for advice. And he came up with an idea to convert the machines into a new game. And this is a very important moment for Nintendo. Given that all of the main designers at Nintendo in Japan were busy at the moment, we find that the task was given instead to Shigeru Miyamoto, who was a young apprentice designer who was tasked for a solution for this problem, who had also worked on Radar Scope. He was hired initially at the company as an artist and first designed illustrations for arcade cabinets. However, he would become the most important designer at this date at Nintendo and in the industry in general. The most important moment in Nintendo history is now, when this project is given to Miyamoto. He is the most important figure that would begin developing what would become standard tropes for the industry. Now, we know that Miyamoto is limited, given the whole purpose of this exercise is to convert existing cabinets to a new game. So he had to stick with the size, dimensions, and everything else relating to the cabinet. So Nintendo is going to, at this time, be very close to securing the license for Popeye. So we find that Miyamoto originally designed the game around 3 characters. However, the deal fell through, and he had to come up with new designs for these characters. Luckily, he had a talent, it turns out, for coming up with original characters, many of which are household names today. So instead of Popeye, he's going to develop a new character with a mustache added to the lead to make his nose more identifiable. He also adds a cap in lieu of a haircut and dungarees to have his arm motion stand out more with the graphics. The main action of the game that he originally designs is hopping over barrels and gaps with a character which is originally called Jumpman, because he jumps. The antagonist of this game was a giant, stubborn, surly gorilla, who Miyamoto importantly pointed out was not an evil villain, for he was actually the captive of Jumpman, who upon breaking free had kidnapped Jumpman's girlfriend, Pauline, in revenge. Now, because he is stubborn as his primary characteristic and defining characteristic, we know that Miyamoto is looking in a Japanese English dictionary and happens upon a synonym for stubborn, which is donkey. Hence, we know that everyone in the world was familiar with King Kong, so he called him Donkey Kong. It is the first non-text game, importantly here, to bother with details of the character's motivations. Why is Jumpman doing this and trying to rescue his girlfriend? Why was she kidnapped in the first place? Why is the gorilla tormenting them so? All of this is very important and is part of the beginnings and the interstitials that run at the beginning and the end of each level. Other games tried to mercilessly copy famous or successful examples, such as Pong, for instance. But other competitors had no idea what to do with Donkey Kong. It was so original. Now, in Donkey Kong, there are 3 levels originally designed by Miyamoto that loop around when completed. And there is just enough randomness to mess up players as they try to predict what will happen with these falling barrels. Level 1 finds the barrels are thrown and rolling down girders, but never seem to touch the middle ladders, and so the player begins to come up with strategies of going up the middle ladders. Level 2, however, we find that Jumpman must run over bolts while avoiding wandering flames. The 3rd level is actually a very complex network of elevators, where Jumpman would bounce between these springs and ladders. The mechanics of the game are quite brilliant, for no matter how much we enjoy being safe, we like the notion of chance. There are very safe ways to play Donkey Kong, and this will be important for the design of later games. So you can play it very safe, which takes a long time of waiting in a predictable pattern, but it doesn't feel as fun or cool to execute. And then there are super fast techniques that will result in easily avoidable death. So this mechanic is going to be seen in most games today. Now, Nintendo's first video game, Mega Smash, would be Donkey Kong, and they couldn't make them fast enough thanks to Miyamoto's design. Now, Jumpman at this time, and at the same time as the rise of Nintendo itself, was renamed Mario, who would become the company's new mascot. During the localization for the American market, Nintendo of America's landlord, Mario Segale, supposedly argued over back rent with, once again, Nintendo of America's president. So supposedly this is where the name Mario comes from, but we cannot confirm if it's merely an urban legend. The success of both of these ventures convinced Yamauchi that Nintendo's future was exclusively in video games, that he would go ahead and create a cartridge-based console designed by Masuki Umura. Uemura's family computer, as it was shortened to Famicom, was released in 1983 and was originally intended as a 16-bit powerhouse, functioning as a home computer with a floppy drive and keyboard. But this was not Nintendo's philosophy. Yamauchi wanted a cheaper system that exclusively played games and was not meant to be used as a home computer. Now, he redesigned it, Uemura did, for the Famicom, and it was sold originally for around $135 with 3 arcade hits, Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr., and Popeye. It was a huge marketing campaign that went along with it, and it did sell 500,000 units within 6 months, and was very successful in Japan proper. So started at this point, we see that many complaints started coming in from buyers and from retailers of defective units. Uemura and Yokoi found instead that the circuitry needed to be replaced in them, and not wanting to tell their angry boss Yamauchi, they unfortunately had to, but recommended they would wait until people complained and then replace them piecemeal. Instead, Yamauchi very famously said, "Recall them all." This proved to be the correct decision, for by the end of 1984, it was the most popular console in Japan with 2.5 million units sold. Having this defect out of the way, Nintendo in 1983 successfully avoided the pitfall that Atari fell into with a poor product. Now, to develop this for the American market, Nintendo almost signed it over to Atari to distribute. But facing the crash after E.T. in 1983, Atari was in no position to be expanding. Instead, Nintendo of America would distribute it, and it would be kept within the company. There was a gradual launch of the NES, or Nintendo Entertainment System, in 1985. Noticeably, there was a delay before they started promoting it, for Nintendo knew that retailers were very skeptical of video games and home video game consoles after the recent crash because they had been burned by Atari. So much capital had been lost on the poor products of games like E.T. We find that retailers believed that Americans no longer had an appetite for video games. But instead, it was discovered that they merely wanted high-quality home video games. Arakawa is going to rename as a marketing campaign for Nintendo of America as much as he could to differentiate Nintendo from Atari. So he says that consoles are now control decks and cartridges are now game packs. Everything they could do to make it sound different and differentiate it. It was a smash hit in Japan and the US, and it was the first console, thanks to this marketing campaign, to sell 61.91 million units worldwide. It was estimated that by 1990, nearly 30% of US homes had an NES in it. The shift at this time can be seen definitively to the Japanese dominance in video game design and manufacturing, and then finally distribution in American markets. Now, the NES, importantly, is a triumph of software and licensing as well as design. Now, because Nintendo was aware that Atari's fate was going to relate to its poor software developers, and of course not giving them credit, they designed a lockout chip for the NES that would prevent any unauthorized cartridges being played on it. They also had very draconian terms for their developers, stating that they could not work for other companies and would license everything solely for Nintendo. The developers, of course, were hesitant at first, but finally agreed when the sales of Nintendo skyrocketed and the future was clear. Enter Miyamoto again with Super Mario Brothers. Now, the games were as much a part of Nintendo's success, and this cannot be overlooked. So returning to Mario, the character that he had invented with Donkey Kong, Miyamoto is going to bring several more technical innovations. Most importantly, with Super Mario Brothers, we have side-scrolling. Now, previously, characters would reach the edge of a given screen, usually moving left to right, and then there would be a delay while the next screen would load. Now we find that Nintendo and Super Mario Brothers is the first platformer with smoothly scrolling left to right transitions as Mario moved through this new universe. Now it could actually be developed into a world instead of small separate vignettes. There were 8 imaginative and increasingly difficult levels in the original Super Mario Brothers, all thanks again to the design genius of Miyamoto. You would, for instance, jump onto enemies or grow into Super Mario after catching an Alice in Wonderland style mushroom. Now, we know that he is renamed, or he looks more like a plumber now, because Miyamoto was told that Jumpman actually looked like a plumber. So why not just take this motif and expand it? And that's where we see this first in Super Mario Brothers, where he punctuated this world with big green pipes, where some led to subterranean layers. The background and everything in it, the game here, is surreal, as we see this pastel blue sky. Stages were made up of chunky bricks that burst apart, floating illogically in the air. And some levels were even underwater. No one had seen anything like this before, especially the president of Nintendo. Because we are so used to seeing the world developed by Miyamoto fleshed out today and developed over decades, we must remember that the world that he designed is punctuated and defined by the visual language of surrealism, much like the movement that came out of Paris in the 1930s between the world wars, whereby we have suspended blocks and bridges that go to nowhere, warp pipes that allow you to skip worlds. Therefore, there's this playfulness with form that is the hallmark of Miyamoto's style. It is a delight to experiment with Super Mario Brothers, even the original, and see what's possible, for we have built into this design invisible blocks and warp zones that must be explored in order to discover. There's a brilliance also in the practical design we must remember. Level 1 would allow the player to practice safely to learn the world's rules. Thus, of course, this is a low-risk exercise as we move into the more complex and challenging levels. And this underpins every subsequent platformer. It doesn't matter if we're talking about a first-person shooter, an RPG, any type of action gaming. This is the language and the rules that are built in thanks to Miyamoto. There is a visual panache associated with his style, where we have brilliant levels and inch-perfect controls as you're going to jump and run across this new world with side-scrolling, and it became a sensation. There were over 40 million copies that were sold, with Mario as a new icon for video games. Thus, the video game history can be seen to be littered with these Mario clones. But it would only be Nintendo who could successfully exploit and reinvent their mascot successfully, and we'll be following the evolution of Mario. There were 2 sequels that quickly followed the original Super Mario Brothers. The first was a harder Japanese version of the original, but Nintendo of America thought it was unsuitable for the United States. Luckily, Nintendo of Japan had a game called Doki Doki Panic, which was built around the premise of pulling vegetables, seen at the lower right here. With a visual overhaul, this game became Super Mario Bros. 2. And while it lacked the speed of the original, it was, however, innovative, and it mixed up the successful formula, showing that Nintendo was willing to gamble and be risky. It became, however, a cultural phenomenon only really with Super Mario Bros. 3, which was released in Japan in 1988, but through crafty marketing was held off until the release in the American market in 1990. So we find that this is the first time through this type of marketing campaign that the climax of the movie Wizard in 1989, about a boy savant who was a genius at playing video games, we can see a sneak peek of Super Mario Bros. 3, and it tells us that Mario can fly. We find that Tezuka would be central to the development of Super Mario World later, and was part of the designing brilliance of this team. It is a masterpiece of conscious artifice, we must remember, if you think back to the complexity of Super Mario Brothers. The title screen, for instance, opens with a curtain raising like a theater. The levels are bolted blocks onto a background. There are platforms suspended by jerry-rigged ropes like on a theater stage. And the levels end with serrated vertical lines at the end of the set, as seen here. The power-ups, interestingly enough, also are putting on costumes. Everything is self-consciously theatrical. Super Mario 3 was one of the first platformers to have both X and Y axis options, where players could explore both left and right, and also up and down. The difficulty curve was also perfectly judged. It started off slow, much like the original Super Mario Brothers, but with greater complexity ramps up. The power-ups, for instance, can be stored in Super Mario 3 until you need to use them instead of immediately transforming Mario. And the original had a warp zone, but now we have to move entirely out of the screen to find these different areas. There is a great amount of innovation in adventure here. The surreal setting is at this point by Super Mario Bros. 3 very commonplace and expected for video gamers. The cacti bop to the rhythm of the music, anthropomorphic clouds float above, there are chain chomps that bark and strain against their restraints to get at Mario and the players, angry suns swoop down from above, all of which are going to bring this very surreal visual language to the player. What can also be seen in Super Mario Bros. 3 is a new menagerie and a very complex series of villains and other characters. And we find that Miyamoto and Tezuka were geniuses at producing all of these very original characters. One of the stories illustrates how they came up with their ideas. Tezuka, of course, worked very late nights very often, but he worked one too many and came home, and his wife then flew into a rage. This became the inspiration for Boo, one of the most famous characters in the Mario universe. This is a shy ghost that would hide its eyes when Mario would face it, and then would hone in and hover towards Mario when his back was turned. With all of these original characters and developments, we find that Super Mario 3 is successful because it can be played in so many different ways. But at the same time, at its core, and that's what grounds it, it is still about Mario rescuing a princess. Now, what happens to sum up the self-conscious nature of the game? Once you vanquish Bowser and save Princess Peach, a curtain falls, as can be seen behind Mario and Bowser here. A very different game would demonstrate the success and the diversity of inspiration that took to create these different types of experiences, as Miyamoto and Tezuka create the Legend of Zelda in 1986. Now, Zelda is born from the childhood experiences, especially of Miyamoto, living in the small town of Sonobo in Kyoto, which is also the home of Nintendo, we should add. As a curious child, Miyamoto would explore, finding new things, and one of his most influential memories is that of finding a cave that he was too afraid to enter the first time he discovered it, coming back the next day with a flashlight. This event would prove to be the core of Zelda. Now, as far as Zelda is concerned, we have a notable absence of an overworld map. All we see are dungeons when we're down there, but above ground, players must use their memory to make their way around this vast universe. Exploration in Zelda is the key, and is infused there by the curiosity of its designer, Miyamoto. And while Miyamoto brought childhood fantasies to the front in Zelda and as part of the inspiration for the gameplay, Tezuka brought his love of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings and a patchwork of these various elements from Peter Pan and King Arthur. And this explains the elemental game arc that would have you start off as an unarmed boy with a wooden sword and end as a warrior. The environment in which Link, the character in Zelda, is played is very open. It is a land of caves, lakes, and forests where the player can explore, where it is filled with monsters, treasures, and secrets, and that is the most important element here that's fundamental to Zelda. Now, it was released in Japan alongside an add-on for the Famicom Disk System in 1986, which had the revolutionary ability to save. However, the hardware flopped in sales, so we find that the first built-in battery-powered RAM was in the cartridges sold for the US. That allowed the ability to save progress. Now, the NES home consoles couldn't come close to the arcade visuals at the same time that were being developed. However, what it could offer is the ability to progress and for persistence. With 128 screens and 8 dungeons, they could be completed in any order here in The Legend of Zelda. The designers were, of course, afraid that players would become bored with the game, but it became the first million-selling console game with over 60 million copies sold. Players explored because they were unsure of where they needed to go next. This opened up a new type of freedom in gaming that we'll talk about later in this lecture. There would be 3 decades of sequels that followed the original Legend of Zelda release in 1986, but it was this original that created the template with an overworld, dungeons below, and the progression structure of acquiring items, seeing the growth of Link from a little squirt with a wooden sword to a gadget-flinging superhero. It should be noted as well that Link is still the greatest name in gaming, that because it indicates that the character is somehow joined to the player as a link. We have this mute adventurer that is defined by the player's actions as he becomes a gateway, a doorway into the game world. We know this because Miyamoto said himself that he wanted players to see part of themselves in Link, to associate with him, thus to invest in this experience. We pause now on the development of Nintendo that we will return to next time to look at the beginnings of the main rival and competitor to Nintendo, Sega. So we find here that the president of Sega Corporation, Hayao Nakayama, is going to see the success of Nintendo and decide to enter the Japanese home console market. Now, at this point in time, Sega was the most successful maker of arcades in the world, but in 1982 they saw a downturn in profits. There was a subsequent corporate restructuring, and thus the new strategy emerges for home consoles. The SG-1000 would be released in 1983, but it was doomed from the start. It was released tragically on the same day as Nintendo's Famicom, and so we know which one was more popular. We find that the SG-1000 was underpowered by comparison, but it did come with some good and quality arcade conversions like Donkey Kong. Lasted barely a year, this new console by Sega. It was quickly replaced by the SG-1002, slightly upgraded, but neither one saw success. As a response to these poor sales, Sega goes back to the drawing board and comes up with the SG-1000 Mark III. With a faster CPU than the Famicom, it had a brighter display of colors and more than double the memory. It was obvious that its hardware was superior, but it was lacking in the side of software. Thanks to Nintendo's draconian license terms with its developers that stopped games from appearing on rival systems, Sega was quite limited. The American release of the Mark III would be the first of Sega's overseas releases, and so they wanted it to be a success. Therefore, they completely redesigned the hardware to look more futuristic. Released a year after the NES, the Sega Master System would, of course, attempt to compete with Nintendo on multiple fronts, costing $200 in the American market at the time, and included arcade conversions. We know it had superior hardware, but was not successful in the US. It did, however, find marginal success in Europe, where Nintendo's dominance was not as pronounced as in America and Japan. It even outsold the NES in the European market. But again, it could not compete with Nintendo's games. A few exceptions of excellent games in this early system would be designed by Hayashida in his Phantasy Star of 1988. The game was built upon the new Japanese role-playing games here, or JRPG. It had visuals that surpassed all of its competitors that we looked at previously with Nintendo, even at this time. It had a pseudo three-dimensional dungeon with spectacular attack animations, very advanced compared to even the Legend of Zelda. The characters as well were not blank avatars. Instead, they were well-written personalities on this journey to solve these issues, gather weapons, and defeat monsters. Another standout example of this early release by Sega is Wonder Boy 3: The Dragon's Trap of 1989. Here we have a game that combines side-scrolling platforming, much like Mario Brothers introduced, with an RPG-like structure, as we just discussed. Here players would explore a large world and have some freedom to move about in different ways, and they would then upgrade their character accordingly. This is akin to Metroid that we will discuss in the next lecture, and the same type of mechanics and rules. Although the Sega Master System had some arcade hits that translated well, like Golden Axe, it sold 13 million units, and this is of course abysmal compared to the 62 million units the NES console sold. Therefore, Sega at this point came too late to the game, with minor hardware superiority, and never would have the same library of software until they learned their lesson, and we see the console wars that we will discuss in the 1990s. This, however, did give Sega one thing. It gave them a foothold into the industry, and the lessons learned by watching what happened to Atari and their lack of success with the release competing against Nintendo would teach them valuable lessons, and so they would be ready for the second round. Turning from home consoles to PC games, we should discuss the founding of Maxis now. Will Wright and Braun are going to co-found this software company as part of Electronic Arts, or EA at the time. Now, this is going to be the design of SimCity that was first developed for the Commodore 64 in 1985. But after the delay of release of 4 years, the two decided to found their own company in order to publish it themselves. Now, after designing a top-down two-dimensional shooter, Wright realized that he actually enjoyed the map editor function more than playing the game itself. This, combined with a deep interest in urban planning, is going to lead him to develop SimCity. What is at the core of SimCity is the theory of system dynamics, whereby we look at how a system and its behavior depends upon internal feedback loops and the way resources flow from one part to another. What is revolutionary about SimCity and Wright's design is that it challenges all previous notions of gaming. That being, it does away with and questions the rigid rules, asking, why does there need to be a winner or loser? Why does there need to be an objective? Why cannot we just play? And this is the origins of open-ended gaming. For in SimCity, the objective is merely to build a city. You, as the mayor or player, can do that however you wish. You begin with land, commercial, that you can design as commercial, industrial, or residential. You then build roads, roadways, and buildings to connect them together, and choose your type of power, whether that be coal, nuclear, etc., building your infrastructure. As this open-ended style of design, the objectives are entirely self-chosen by the player. The only circumscription is going to be Wright's personal bias, and there is very obvious bias in the game. For instance, if you decide to choose nuclear power plants, they are unrealistically dangerous and lead to meltdowns, and cities that are linked by railway are going to be much happier than those with a system of crisscrossing highways, therefore pushing this type of urban planning agenda. The brilliance in the design is actually every problem that is faced throughout the course of the game can be traced back to and as a consequence of your first early decisions. A testament to the success of SimCity is the great number of sequels that are going to come after it, but they are all built on the initial ideas and premise of the 1985 version. In 2003, for instance, SimCity 4 is going to be the first to build in a 3D engine that allows the camera to rotate around the entire city and seeing all of the elements that you're putting together. The first time to do so was quite striking. It's also stripped away all the fussy aspects of SimCity, but retained the complexity of the underlying systems that made it enjoyable. There were many spin-offs and different titles of Sims, such as Sim Farm, Sim Earth, Sim Life, Sim Tower, Sim Isle, and Sim Health. But the strangest and oddest one has to be Sim Ant, released in 1991, which was inspired by Wright after reading the encyclopedic work on how ant colonies operate. Now, knowing that the premise was very dry and dull, he had to make the design less dry and more traditionally gamey by its content. Therefore, you would control a black ant colony in a backyard that gradually expanded, while fighting off red ants and driving away the occupants of the house. It is an accurate representation of how an ant colony actually works, with you controlling individual ants by laying down pheromone trails to guide their operations. And as seen here, you can observe on a micro or a macro scale. Therefore, it plays like a strategy game. Arguably, though, the culmination of Maxis's work, this company, would be the creation of The Sims. Now, The Sims began as an architectural simulator where players construct individual houses and then Sims would visit them, these computer people that would then pass judgment and mock you based on what you did wrong. However, they decided early on, while watching people play it, that the Sims were actually the real stars, not the architecture. So the game, unfortunately, tested badly when they originally designed it, and the higher-ups had no faith. They called it the toilet game because you would have to tell the players when to go urinate and defecate. So it would be kept alive as a secret project by Wright for a number of years before its release. At the core of The Sims is the AI of the titular characters. They are able to react to any layout that the players produce, which is of course quite impressive. Anything you can build, they had to develop an AI that could react and interact with it. And of course it is fun and quirky to watch them do so. Now, it begins with the purchase of a vacant lot when you start the game. Then you begin constructing a house in build mode. Finally, the Sims would move in. You would instruct and interact with them as you tell them to interact with household objects, go to the restroom, eat, watch TV, etc. Now, there is an amount of free will built in with these Sims, but if they are neglected long enough, for instance, they would pee themselves, or the long-term consequences would be they would become a dropout and a couch potato. The sequel, Sims 2, released in 2004, greatly improved upon the original with a fully three-dimensional environment. However, it kept the simple interactions there, along with the underlying complexity. There are also more stages of life to age through now, and more appearance parameters. The sim can be constructed to look in a number of various ways, and you can control, of course, and tell them their expressions and dictate their social interactions. The body shape also of your sim as it ages is affected by its diet and exercise. As well, the career that you choose for your sim will lead to certain rewards based on what area they're in. Now, what The Sims does with the second installation is focus on what actually matters to players, the interaction and development of and watching their sim. The ultimate entry, however, in this series would be The Sims 3 in 2009. With a greatly expanded world, you would observe and direct the daily routines of The Sims. It also streamlines the tasks that you're asked to do. Obviously, telling your sim when they need to urinate and relieve themselves is somewhat tasking. And so we're going to remove that and streamline how we engage with them. Unfortunately, Sims 4 is going to greatly anger fans because it removed most of the features that were expected that could be purchased later on as expansions, and it's a different type of design for gaming. But all the Sims are going to have websites relating to them, such as the Exchange, where you can download custom content. Now this demonstrates that the Sims is a cultural phenomenon, given the amount of time, effort, and resources put into the different types of upgrades and content that you can customize your Sim world with. But again, in summary, we could state that SimCity pioneered a style of open-ended play that we're going to discuss here in a moment with the development of the first-person shooter, and was very influential in multiple genres. Whereas the Sims are going to bring that to an individual level of open-ended play, bringing in the human element, and that taps into a basic aspect of the human mind. We enjoy making our own stories, and we cannot help but projecting ourselves onto these characters. It is actually, if we think about it, a scenario generator where stories will play out that are benign, banal, and things that we see on an everyday basis. Everything from work, family life, love, anger, hope, and even significantly, the Sims were the first to allow same-sex relationships, which was very unusual in the gaming industry at the time. So in many ways, it's forward-thinking. Moving from The Sims and open-ended gameplay, we turn now to the most popular and commercially viable genre in the world, the first-person shooter. Now, first-person shooter video games are also the focus of most controversy due to the violence displayed in the medium. They are bemoaned by sophisticates who find them rather simple and adored by the masses. Now, it is one of the simplest forms of interaction in gaming, aim and shoot, but it is the consistent driving force behind innovation and technology in games at the same time, moving the gaming industry forward, as once again we will talk about the quick evolution of first-person shooters. And it all began with an empty maze. Steve Culley was a student at NASA Ames Research Center in California, working on an MLAC PDS-1, which was the first low-cost vector graphics computer. Now, the difference here is that raster scan displays, such as seen here with the green text, are going to be more common, with a grid of pixels that are going to be updated with a sweeping CRT beam. We find that vector graphics, on the other hand, are clean, sharp lines that are brought together point to point. Now, in his Maze War, originally designed in 1977 and released again in 86, he originally designs a simple maze with 3D displays with his vector graphics. Now, the game is meant to be explored as you move through as an eyeball, that's your avatar here, this maze. However, players quickly became bored, Culley found. So he put people in the maze, as was suggested, and connected different computers together so they could play at the same time. Obviously, starting off, there were only 2 or 3 computers because we have to develop wider access to the internet. Now, he invented countless features that are still used today, where you have players as an avatar, an eyeball in this instance, and a secondary top-down 2-dimensional map to judge position, as seen here on the left. Now, it was played across the ARPANET in 1977, and the PC release over the internet was 1986. Now, it was probably the first game played across the modern internet. Though the other game that also tries to claim that would be Jim Bowery's Spacism of 1974, which is a contraction of Space Simulator. It was released on the Play-Doh network. Now, in this, you could have 32 players that could play over 4 planetary systems. The players would be in teams shooting phasers and photon torpedoes at one another, obviously inspired by Star Trek. Now, we know that Maze Wars and Spacism both were limited by their technologies. Obviously, we do not have a large internet to share this information with, and so multiple players can engage with it. At the same time, Maze Wars is limited because players can only move at 90-degree angles. Spacism, we find that the positions are updated only once a second. Therefore, we have a very staggered frame rate here. It should be noted that the simulator was inspired by Battlezone that Ed Rotberg is going to develop for the US Army. So it's the first commercial first-person shooter, as you can understand that here. Now, the first-person shooter genre, as we see it evolve, will require two things. Obviously, clear visuals and smooth movement, both of which have yet to be achieved, but now the developers know what direction they need to go. The first steps towards the modern style of first-person shooter is developed by Looking Glass Studios in Ultima Underworld in 1992, which was an action exploration RPG game, in which you would search a dungeon while mapping it, finding items, fighting monsters, and leveling up, which sounds very familiar if we think about the other RPG-like games we just discussed. Now, the combat is in real time, therefore we find large numbers of possible approaches accompany this. At the same time, Robert Prince is going to be developing an infinitely inspirational first-person shooter in 1992, Wolfenstein 3D. Now, this game moved smoothly, and it had bags of gore, which was quite unusual for the time, thinking back to all the other RPG-style games. It was a critical and commercial success, and had a very innovative release as shareware. We find that you could get a free demo of the game, and it included instructions of how to get access to the full game. Now, you played as a Rambo-like character, B.J. Blazkowicz, who specialized in blowing Nazis away. The addition of an on-screen hand and gun were the genius element for Wolfenstein 3D, because it was not functional, but instead psychological. The first one to have this personal perspective being immersed by default. That's what first-person shooters does, because we can see everything. But on top of that, now we even have an extension of the player's limb into the screen, and we become part of the game. Much that they hoped Link would provide a link into the game, now it is literal. Building upon Wolfenstein 3D, we have John Carmack's Doom of 1993, one of the most influential games ever, inspiring all first-person shooters that would follow. The premise is quite simple. The player is a space marine in hell, and the main premise is for you to get to the exit, and there are monsters in between you and the exit. It is a combination of fluid motion, speed, and cacophonous sound effects. The visual style is a mixture of science fiction and pulp horror, with a bright visual palette, distended enemy designs, and the game's rhythm is influenced by the metal soundtrack that is hammering and blasting alongside your gun. It has as much gore and vague satanic symbolism as possible, even including pentagrams. No game has since matched its shotgun sound effect that has been replicated ad nauseum. The weapons also set the template for all first-person shooters to follow. You begin with a simple pistol, then you move on to a shotgun, followed by a chain gun, a rapid-fire plasma rifle, and there must be a culminating weapon. In Doom, it is the BFG 9000 that charges up until you have a death pulse that kills everything in front of you. The game is viscerally and incredibly satisfying when played, given these elements are brought together. The design is one in which we're going to emphasize fear and the adrenaline caused by the situation that is amplified by the soundtrack and the experiences, but it is followed by catharsis as you have this letdown after you escape. Now, while Doom is not the pioneer of a multiplayer online PC game, it is immensely influential. It can play up to 4 at a time connected to a server, in which you would attempt to frag or kill other players. If you were killed, you would then respawn or revive at a random location. The appeal of competitive multiplayer games is as follows. Human opponents are more satisfying than artificial intelligence opponents to play against. Humans, of course, are devious, accurate, smart, and most importantly, consistently surprising. They never seem to do what you think they will. And fragging another player is always more satisfying than a computer AI. There was so much demand when the game first was released in 1993 that the computer network on the university it was housed crashed immediately. Now, Carmack programmed in Doom the ability to easily replace the audio and the visuals, and even made the level editor available to those that purchased it. This is the most important part for the longevity of Doom and other platforms and other games like it. For you have an entire generation of modifiers or modders that are going to build their own games using these tools. The most important game to popularize this genre is Doom. Following upon the success of Doom, John Romero would help design Quake and release it in 1996. Now, it is unlike the Doom engine that uses two-dimensional floor plans to render three-dimensional environments. It is a true 3D game, which is going to have less limitations. The Quake engine was built specifically to address these limitations. Now, it features, firstly, jumping. Obviously, in Doom, you could not jump. It also had multi-tiered levels and physics elements built into it. So it is similar to Doom in that it has a muted palette, but it has also Lovecraftian influence on the enemies. The most important change with Quake is that it focused on multiplayer modes, new modes of mapping and more capability possessed by the avatars. Players learn tricks such as to shoot at the apex of a jump to boost them further into the air, now called rocket jumping. Now, this popularized new ways for communities to play games and created new subgenres. For instance, speedrunning became prominent in 1997, where players would record themselves completing Quake on nightmare difficulty level. This led to certain recordings like Quake Done Quick. Now, you could download and watch these, learning certain tricks. Now, in fact, Speed Demos Archive, which is a website dedicated to hosting speedrunning records, started with Quake and the speedrun archive it had. Now, this opened up a new arena. Machinima, as it would become known, is the use of video games or game tools to create a movie of any length. Players initially recorded gameplay of themselves for years and or talking about games, but it was not until Diary of a Camper in 1996, which was a short minute-and-a-half video of a camper that would sit in one spot waiting to surprise enemies and kill them. The gag, of course, was that he was John Romero, the designer of Doom. Now, Machinima.com is the codified name that was set in 2000 and a new form of expression that we see in multiple areas. The most famous examples would be Red vs. Blue Halo, South Park, Make Love Not Warcraft, which was seen in the episode of South Park, and Team Fortress 2. It would be Quake that inspired them all. Building upon their earlier success, id's finest hour would come from Quake 3 that abandoned the single-player narrative, instead focusing entirely on the multiplayer experience and the tools available for modders to recreate the game as they saw fit. This pioneered the break with the first-person shooter genre, which initially had a narrative set up for the single player moving through levels. Now we're exclusively focusing on competitive multiplayer experience in different arenas. This is now a precision shooter where every element is about the competitive experience. It required a dedicated graphics card to run, but that led to a visually stunning experience and would allow for the player to run at very high speeds without dropping frames. Players describe the gameplay as crisp or clean in its experience. There is no clutter, and there is an openness of design, which meant that mods, like the Challenge Pre-Mode Arena of 2000, could deliver standardized parameters. Now, this is foundational for esports, as you have the organized multiplayer video game competitions, which are particularly played between professional players and teams. Developing alongside the first-person shooters would be first-person exploration games like Miller's Myst of 1993 by Ubisoft. Here we find that there is no shooting. Instead, it is a slow burner game set within a beautiful island and filled with puzzles the player navigates and solves. Now, Myst saw huge sales, and so forward-thinking design here is part of the success, in that there are no enemies per se in Myst. The narrative instead is ambiguous and fragmentary at best. There is no time limit, and at the start of the game, there are no objectives. The player decides what, when, and where to explore and what to do. This establishes a new kind of adventure game that is now back in vogue. These also have very unusual narrative mechanics, like Dear Esther on the left and Gone Home on the right here. An interesting hybrid of Myst and Quake can be found in Half-Life by Valve, released in 1998. Now, the game was actually based on a heavily modified Quake engine, and it does have gunplay, but it is in the lineage of Myst, for we have a new narrative sophistication that is developed for first-person shooters, using the environment and very specialized pacing. There are no cutscenes, for instance, in Half-Life, and it is scripted at moments, with the player always remaining in control of the main character, Gordon Freeman. Now, Freeman is a physicist at Black Mesa Research Facility. It opens on Freeman going to work on a tram with a 5-minute sequence where we see the normal operation of the facility, the technology, the automation, and its high security. Along with this, the tram's computerized voice provides more context with announcements for what will follow. Now we find here, this is an example of showing, not telling in gameplay. The premise is that Freeman is part of an experiment gone wrong, opening a rift that lets in hostile Zen aliens to Earth. The few survivors that make it out of the facility begin battling Zen and government special forces, for the government wants no witnesses for this particular mess up. Now, whereas Doom, you have a hostile universe where everything must be shot. Half-Life, instead, is seen as an inhabited place gone hostile, and feels like a place people actually work rather than a series of arenas, and of course is going to be instrumental for later franchises like Resident Evil. Now, there are puzzles here that range from physics challenges to utilizing the environment against overwhelming odds. The gunplay moves beyond Doom's predictability and now brings in a different variety of weapons like grenade launchers, crossbows, ray guns, a Zen homing gun, and a flesh-burrowing parasite launcher of all things. A very innovative company, Valve would take different versions of these mods and have people develop, showing what their engine could actually do, with examples such as Team Fortress Classic, Counter-Strike, and Day of Defeat. In it, we have an innovative series on areas of AI where the Valve team had designers show what could actually be done with the sophisticated engines. So they adopted most of the popular Half-Life mods and then hired creators. Often they would even be released as standalone products. Here we have a new standard in environmental narrative, made possible first by Half-Life. Whereas Half-Life gave a new standard in environmental narrative, now with Thief: The Dark Project, another product by Looking Glass Studios released in 1998, we have a new standard in environmental interaction. Now, it is from the typical first-person shooter's viewpoint, but the mechanics focused instead on avoiding detection. Along with the medieval setting, we have a very different and unique type of game. Now, there is no on-screen map here, and instead you are forced to rely on your eyes and ears, especially your ears. For the main character, Garrett could be heard with his footsteps by the guards. Now, walking at different speeds and on different surfaces also affected the volume of your footsteps and the noise you made. The guards also made noise and talked amongst themselves. The stealth mechanic is also light. Visibility, as it were, is going to be indicated by an on-screen gem. You do not want to be seen. Therefore, this creates a rhythm of moving between shadows and spying on enemies. Now, it could become boring because there's a lot of time spent simply standing still, but the voyeuristic charm of observing AI enemies and listening to conversations, which are well written and acted, containing useful information, is, of course, entertaining. This also leads to later games that we'll talk about, such as Hitman. Now, before we have Thief, first-person shooter enemies had only two states. They either noticed you or they didn't. Now, here we have a much more complex style of AI, which could, of course, become suspicious of noises and of unusual sights, and then begin searching for you. So there is more complexity to the AI. Now, the locations for Thief are enormous, and there are many ways to approach the game while avoiding enemies. The goal, as the name suggests, is going to be to steal items at each level, which becomes increasingly difficult as you move on from area to area with more things to find and it becoming harder to steal them. Now, Thief, along with Ultima Underworld and System Shock 2, shows that Looking Glass Studios had an enormous impact on first-person shooter games in the genre, introducing psychological horror and spatial complexity along with the AI complexity. All of these resonate today in first-person shooters. Now, Half-Life 2 and Thief, we're going to see this evolution. Moving from Half-Life to Thief, we have a first-person shooter game that transitions from shooting galleries where enemies hone in or fire from a distance to a more intricate system that can be toyed with and played with. So combat is still going to be the core mechanic in both games, but the AI and environments are now more complex and are complex enough to present new scenarios for the players. The first-person shooter games, interestingly, are well suited to PCs because the PC control uses a mouse and a keyboard, but they were not as suited for consoles because of these limitations. The first that was successful in releasing on a home console is going to be for Nintendo 64, developed by Rare, and that is GoldenEye 007, one of the first and greatest hits of Nintendo 64. It is based on the film of the same name, and it is unusual because most licensed games are very underwhelming and fall flat. It is built on the film and allows the player, and this is the success of GoldenEye, it allows the player to explore levels that are only glimpsed in the film, appearing as though you're getting a behind-the-scenes tour of the realm and the world of Bond. Each level begins with Bond and his silenced PP7 pistol, where he is going to shoot guards before they notice. Now, the windows, as seen here on the right, are one way in the player's favor, so you could observe enemies and or shoot them through the glass. It also introduced the most iconic weapon for first-person shooters, the sniper rifle fitted with a suppressor. It is the first instance where you can actually have an adjustable zoom, making it harder to aim and hit targets that are quite distant. The levels are also structured to be completed partially by stealth with great attention to detail, whereby adjusting game difficulty levels also importantly adjust the objectives in the game that can be completed in any order. Now, enemies would respond again to localized damage. As set up in the rules of first-person shooters, a headshot is an instant kill, whereas a leg shot or hitting a limb or extremity merely made a soldier grasp the area in shock. Other areas of realism we find here, bullets are going to leave holes in walls, and distant enemies could hear gunfire and be attracted to it. And if Bond died, given the first-person perspective, blood would stream down from the top of the screen while the camera pans as though you're falling over to the ground. It is difficult now to appreciate GoldenEye because the variable frame rate and refresh is going to find that moments of high action and quick movement often buffer. but it did feature a 2 to 4 player mode on the same screen, whereby you're playing at the same time, and it is the best multiplayer experience available in 1997 without the internet, and is built around the capabilities of the machine with 4 controller ports. Building on GoldenEye, which of course was a licensed video game that was after a film, we now have a film that is going to become a video game as well with Medal of Honor. Now here we find that Steven Spielberg was already developing an interest in first-person shooters. While he was in production in 1997 for Saving Private Ryan, he saw his son playing GoldenEye, which was also released in 1997, and came up with an idea. He pitched the idea to DreamWorks Interactive, or DWI, that thought that no one would actually want to play a game based on World War II, based on real historical events, because all the other games we've discussed are going to be based around aliens or monsters or other dimensions. Instead, the idea of Normandy Beach, which was his initial pitch, became Medal of Honor, the highest U.S. Army award. Now, the game, of course, was fun and an authentic shooter, but was also intended to be an elegy to the fallen in World War II. Now, to ensure historical accuracy and, of course, accuracy of dialogue and action, Saving Private Ryan's military advisor, Captain Del Dye, is going to be contracted as well to oversee production of Medal of Honor. Here, we ensure that there are accurate locations, dates, and a constant feed of info about World War II, which of course is fascinating and also accurate. This is a new type of immersion where we can say this is almost the first nonfiction video game ever. However, the character that you're playing never existed, and the events are reimagined instead of retold, right? So you're not playing someone who actually lived or died in Normandy. That they thought would, of course, broach impropriety. Now, the levels are structured, thanks to the advisor, much like military missions, infiltrating, engaging targets, and then escaping. Even in the top left here, you can see you impersonate a Nazi with fake papers. This is a new genre, and it inspires a new series of games that are very popular today, non-fiction games. And of course, Medal of Honor had multiple sequels that last until today. Finally, we will round out the new millennium with Deus Ex, built in the Unreal Engine and released in 2000. This is going to be a first-person shooter that stretches the genre components as far as they can go. There are new open environments, multiple ways to make your way through the game. And it is a stealth game because the enemies are almost blind. Now, what is interesting about Deus Ex is that you can disrupt the system in this cyberpunk fashion by reprogramming turrets to shoot enemies instead, watching the patrol routes of your enemies, and then laying proximity mines. And most objects that you see in the game can be picked up or moved. Now, levels, importantly, can be played in countless ways. You can either follow the orders you are given or deliberately mess them up and watch what happens. So this open-ended progression we have seen evolving from titles like Myst, where this gives us a new type of freedom of play. So at the turn of the new millennium, the first-person shooter genre had evolved beyond the Doom template. Now there is room for more expansive environments and interactions and controlled narratives. The popularity of first-person shooters means that they are the publisher's favorite genre because they are, once again, going to ensure high sales. Next time, we will continue on with the console wars in the next generation from 1995 to 2000.